Hello and welcome to All Indians Matter. I am Ashraf Engineer. I want to start by quoting from a book, Christophe Jaffrelot's Modi's India, Hindu Nationalism and the Rise of Ethnic Democracy. And I quote, Authoritarianism finds expression in neutralizing not only political opposition, but any institutional power center. In the cases of institutions whose office holders are not freely appointed by the executive, this neutralization policy can follow contrasting routes, ranging from co-optation to intimidation. The former is a corrupt practice that may imply financial transactions or sinecures, including post-retirement appointments. The latter implies the use of state agencies, including those in charge of law and order, whose capture, therefore, is one of the ruler's priorities. Stop quote. Among the various worries about and threats to Indian democracy is the capture of institutions, hobbling their independence and objectivity and posing a threat to liberties and the democratic process. We have witnessed this with worry over the past few years and much has been written about it. But how does this happen and what does it mean for individual citizens like you?
All Indians Matter.
Christophe Jaffrelot is a French political scientist and Indologist specializing in South Asia, particularly India and Pakistan. He is a professor of South Asian politics and history at the CERI at Sciences Po in Paris, a professor of Indian politics and sociology at the King's India Institute in London, and a research director at CNRS in Paris. He is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Christophe, welcome.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Christophe, what does it take to build institutions that you base a democracy on? What has been India's journey since 1947 on that front?
Well, there is no democracy without institutions in the first place, because there is no democracy when there is no separation of power. This is a classic, basic principle of democracy. The executive power, the legislative power, the judiciary have to be independent to some extent, at least not confused or so interdependent that they lose their independence. And I must say India had a rather remarkable trajectory on that front after independence, partly because of the legacy of the Raj, which paradoxically had started to democratize by building a legislative body, by building a judiciary. But of course, it's after Dr. Ambedkar and all the Constituent Assembly people framed the 1950 Constitution that you could see the architecture of this institutional arrangement, with something I would like to emphasize, a remarkably independent judiciary. There are very few bodies like the Supreme Court of India that is very independent for many different reasons. One, you cannot get rid of a Chief Justice or a Justice that easily. The Constitution of India forces the Parliament to go for impeachment, an impeachment-like procedure, something very difficult, and no justice has ever been impeached. So the judiciary was very strong, the Parliament was very strong, and not only because it's enshrined in the Constitution, but also because the practices of the first governments of India and Jawaharlal Nehru's governments in the first place made Parliament, well, the temple of democracy Narendra Modi referred to. This is indeed the place where you have debates, where you have deliberations. And remember how Manmohan Singh was sitting in the Parliament, listening, responding, interacting. Remember the committees, Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha committees, where laws were crafted. The manufacturing of the laws was remarkable. Well, these are the building blocks of democracy, places where you alternative power centers. The executive power cannot rule without taking into account at least two other power centers, including Parliament and the judiciary.
It's interesting you say that because it's been just a day, as we record this, it's been just a day since Rahul Gandhi has been disqualified from
We'll return to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, we'll refer to that as we go along. But before we do that, Christophe, Why is the capture of institutions so important to authoritarians?
Well, precisely because they don't want any division of power. The basic definition of authoritarianism that we find in a book by Juan Linz, the best theoretician, to my mind, of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. This basic definition says authoritarianism is reduction of pluralism. Well, it's very large, it's very broad, but precisely that's what we like in a definition. It can apply to different contexts. Pluralism is what authoritarian regimes dislike the most. So if you have different power centers, you have, of course, pluralism, and that's what they want to fight against. It can be, of course, expanded to other alternative power centers, including the media. So authoritarian regimes will also not only fight against the institutions which are enshrined in the constitution, but also the institutions which are, well, like the media, the fourth estate. This is the fourth pillar. The executive, the legislative, the judiciary, and the media. These are the four institutions the authoritarian regimes will fight against.
You write that in India, Narendra Modi has used a large palette of such practices. Could you detail some of that? And then let's talk about Rahul Gandhi in this context too.
Well, there are so many practices that need to be referred to there. Number one, the government of India did not used to be a one-man show. The government of India, if you go back to, of course, Nehru's years where you had stalwarts. No, do remember the first government of independent India, where you had not only Congress leaders, of course, Vallabhbhai Patel, of course, but also Shyam Prasad Mukherjee from the Hindu Mahasabha, but also Baba Saheb Ambedkar from the Scheduled Caste Federation. So it was a team. It was a teamwork, and it continued. Just remember the UPA government. Who was there? Chidambaram, Jairam Ramesh. The list is very long. Again, a teamwork. Manmohan Singh was certainly not monopolizing power within this government. So, number one, the government has changed a lot and is not as collective, as collegial as it used to be. Number two, parliament. Parliament was a place where you had debates, and debates have become very, very rare in India's parliament today. Of course, the farmers' laws were probably the worst moment in the Indian parliament so far as deliberations are concerned. But you don't need to go that far. When does the prime minister attend parliament? Where do you see joint parliamentary committees making it possible, for instance, that a personal data protection bill, just to take one example, can be debated, discussed, and some consensus manufactured? Government, parliament, the judiciary. The judiciary is, of course, key to democracy. And what we've seen recently is, well, primarily an attempt at reforming the way judges are designated, are appointed. The first bill that the Modi government introduced in parliament as early as June 2014 was an attempt at reforming the way judges are appointed. All authoritarian regimes do it. Orban has done it in Hungary, Kaczynski has done it in Poland, Erdogan has done it in Turkey, no exception. The Supreme Court resisted, but we saw the problem afterwards. Even if you keep the collegium system, you need the validation of the appointment by the government. And when this validation does not come, you have vacancies. And we have had dozens of vacancies. Judges seen as not pliable enough are not appointed. And as a result, the Supreme Court has resigned itself, and the collegium people have resigned themselves to exclude the judges who could not make it, who would not be validated. Number one. Number two, you have this post-retirement jobs business. How do you make a sitting judge more complacent? Well, by promising or by hinting at a post-retirement job. And Justice Gogoi joined Rajya Sabha in this context. Of course, this is something even Arun Jaitley, when he was in the opposition, criticized, and for good reasons. And thirdly, you have an attempt at twisting the arms of justices. Blackmailing, that's the word Bhushan used, and I think for good reasons.
Prashant Bhushan, the Supreme Court.
Prashant Bhushan, exactly, the son of his father. Shanti Bhushan, who was justice minister during the Janta Party phase, and of course, impeccable records in terms of human rights and so on. Blackmailing means what? Well, none of these judges are saints. Well, very few of them are absolutely without any practice that can be seen as corrupt. Well, when you have a fight on everybody, it's much easier to blackmail also judges. For all these reasons, what we've seen in the last few years in India is unprecedented. Even during the emergency, the Supreme Court of India dared to say no to the government at least once. This time, since 2017, we've not seen the government censored anyway by the Supreme Court of India. Either they agree with the government of India, and you have the electoral bonds under sealed cover validated, or you have the Aadhaar bill seen as a money bill, or you have, well, so many laws have been validated, or they sit on the cases and they abstain from any decision. The CAA, the abolition of Article 370, still pending 3 years later. No, that's unprecedented. Never, ever before the Supreme Court of India had behaved like that. Well, there may be many other examples, but I will concentrate on these ones which are so significant. Government, parliament, judiciary, well, we are back to executive, legislative, and the judiciary, and these are the pillars of a democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might just point out to listeners that when Christophe refers to the lack of debate, we've just had the union budget passed without any debate whatsoever. I think the one time that the Supreme Court could have been said to censure, well, maybe not censure the government, but at least disagree with it, is in its recent pronouncement on the appointment of the Chief Election Commissioner, where they said that it would have to be a committee of the Supreme Court, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition. That's probably the last.
Also the CBI, also the CBI chief. That was a recent dissent. You're right. Maybe there is hope.
I'm going to ask you about hope, but a little later in the episode. But Rahul Gandhi. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's been just a day or two since he's been disqualified when we record this. I mean, how do you see that?
It may be a turning point for many reasons. Number one, liberal democracies do not disqualify opponents from parliament. That may affect the soft power of India at a time when, as the host of the G20, the idea of promoting the image of the country as the mother of democracy has gained momentum. It's not the most important dimension, but it's not unimportant either. Number two, till now, the victimization repertoire was one of the repertoires of Narendra Modi himself. He was a victim. He was a victim of the establishment, of the liberal establishment. The Lutyens people, the Khan Market gang, the NDTV reporters who started to expose him in Gujarat in 2002. He was a victim like others, or you can say plebeians were also victims. And that went together with this idea that I'm a Chaiwala, I come from the people, I'm an OBC, really played a lot on this. It's a very important, very powerful repertoire, the victimization repertoire. Will he make a victim of Rahul Gandhi now? That is something that can make a difference. So that's this number two variable that needs to be factored. Of course, if he goes to jail, that will be even more dramatic. But that's the number three factor that needs to be considered. If he doesn't, he'll be in the street. And therefore, he will have one more opportunity to do what he has done with the last yatra. And a new yatra would probably be the right response to the situation is facing. And this one from Gujarat to the northeast for a change, across Uttar Pradesh, for instance. Number four, everywhere in regimes of that kind, when authoritarianism gained momentum, opposition leaders closed ranks. You look at Turkey next month, there'll be only one candidate against Erdogan. You look at Israel, last year, there was only one candidate against Netanyahu. Opponents realize that it's existential. The threat is existential. When the leader of opposition is neutralized that way, even Arvind Kejriwal has to speak out. We would have expected Arvind Kejriwal, such an opponent to Congress, a rival for such a long time. So possibly you will see state party leaders of Bihar, of UP, where Mayawati may go back to active politics, of West Bengal, of Kerala, of course, there'll be others, and they could possibly join hands with those who are already following the UPA coalition from Maharashtra, from Tamil Nadu. Number five is, what will the judiciary do now? And we are back to this ray of hope that we have mentioned before. Can the judiciary validate a verdict like this one at the Supreme Court level? And if it doesn't, if it is indeed the North Star of India's democracy, well, for the first time, the BJP will have forced the Supreme Court to take a stand against the government. And that will possibly change the balance of power. Well, now there are, of course, many caveats. And the ball is not only in the court of the Supreme Court. Primarily, it is in the court of the Supreme Court. But it is also in the court of the opposition leaders, because many people may be for sale, and the Jyotirao Scindia's syndrome may have new takers. It's so easy to promise a portfolio, to get something in return. So that's an important caveat. And last but not least, the ball is in the court of Rahul Gandhi himself. What will he do? And will he make sure that he will continue what has been already initiated to take the Congress back to its social movement's roots? Because that's what the first yatra was about. Of course, it was about mobilizing the party cadres, but it was also about a social movement, modus operandi.
Absolutely. And I think there has been talk actually of an East-West Yatra, but I don't think it's fructified yet. But let's get back to the institutions, Christophe. One of the first examples you cite in your book is Modi's support for the Lokpal when not in power, and then dithering when in power. And eventually, of course, the Lokpal was appointed at the end of Modi's first term, but it was with very diluted powers. So talk us through that.
Yeah. Well, again, a very good example of how national populists operate. If you remember the years 2011, 2012, 2013, it was all about corruption of Manmohan Singh, the Colgate, and so on and so forth. The CAG reports, so on and so forth. And Anna Hazare was, of course, supported by Kejriwal and Baba Ramdev and so many others, but also by Narendra Modi, who considered that it was key for India's democracy to have a Lokpal. And they wrote a letter I cite in my book to Anna Hazare supporting his movement. He takes over in 2014, and of course, Anna Hazare himself asked for the Lokpal to take shape. But when you do not want to share power, when you do not want to be under any kind of control, you do not take the risk of having a Lokpal watching over your shoulder. So the dilution will take place eventually, but before even the dilution, there was a postponement. The postponement of the appointment of the Lokpal is a remarkable episode. They did not, the government of India refused to appoint a Lokpal for years because there was no leader of the opposition. And according to the law, the Lokpal had to be appointed by a committee, including a leader of the opposition. And why was there no leader of the opposition? Because Congress did not get 10% of the seats in parliament, which is something the speaker considered as absolutely necessary. So that went on and on. The Supreme Court had to jump in, had to ask for the opposition to be represented in this committee. Well, I cut a long story short. Finally, just before the 2019 elections, so just before the end of the first term, as you said, at last, Lokpal was appointed. Have you heard about him? Have you heard the Lokpal of India saying anything?
Just the most silent institution ever.
Exactly. And for the reasons you've mentioned, dilution, but also, well, you pick and choose someone who will not make your life too complicated. But maybe there is no corruption. That may be the reason.
Christophe, you need to spend more time in India, I think. All right, let's talk about the Central Information Commission too. Now, the right to information was a very, very big step in Indian democracy, just as during the UPA years. Now, could you talk about the descent into utter dysfunctionality of the Central Information Commission? Now, when it was launched, like I said, it was a huge step. Now it borders on ineffectiveness.
Yeah. Well, again, we need to go back to history and see what happened in 2014. In August 2014, the incumbent had to retire. And one of the techniques the Modi government is repeatedly using, it works with the judiciary as well, is not to replace those who retire. Vacancies. So between 2016 and 2018, there was no chief information commissioner. So the Supreme Court had to intervene and ask for some vacancies to be filled, some posts to be filled. That happened, but 4 appointments, 4 information commissioners were not appointed. The backlog of pending appeals reached more than 28,000 cases at that time. Of course, if you do not have the manpower, it becomes dysfunctional. And that's the objective. You do not scrap the institution. You do not do anything particularly dramatic. You just don't appoint anybody. And it stops working. It cannot work. That's what they did with the judiciary, by the way. And you remember Justice Thakur crying for appointments of judges at the High Court's level. So that was the first decision that was made. But there was another decision that was made. Many domains remained or became unanswerable. Defense, of course, but also finance. The RBI and the public banks represented 1/3 of the rejections of the request after demonetization. You could not know anything about what happened during demonetization by resorting to RTI, when it is precisely what RTI is meant for. RTI is meant for fighting opacity, making understandable decisions you don't understand. How do you explain demonetization if you do not have RTI Act to help you? Number 3, yes, there was a dilution again of the RTI Act, and that came just after the 2019 elections, when the fixed tenure of 5 years for the chief information commissioners was abolished, and even the salaries were not set. You made the commissioners' status very vulnerable to create precisely a new dependence. And it's very sad to see that RTI, that was such a magnificent addition to the Indian democracy, right to information in addition to right to education, in addition to right to food, that was what the Manmohan Singh government had given to India, in addition to NRAGA, of course. And all this, including NRAGA, have lost what was making India social democracy-like, something that was more egalitarian and less opaque.
Christophe, I'm also concerned about the use of enforcement agencies like the CBI and more recently the Enforcement Directorate to target the opposition. Now, once the opposition leaders who are being targeted switch sides, suddenly the inquiry disappears.
Yes, and you are again inviting me to look at history, recent history, but when we, and that's what my book is about, when we try to understand how a country transitions to authoritarianism, you have to focus on these moments. The moment when an institution loses its independence, its autonomy at least. Well, in the case of CBI, I'm sure you also remember the way Alok Verma, the CBI chief, was finally eased out. This is a key moment. And it happened in 2016, 17, 18. It took time. It was very tedious. And I don't want to go into the tediousness of the process too much. But at the end of the day, there was finally Prime Minister Committee that was formed with the Chief Justice and his representative as the key players. And they finally invited Mr. Verma to leave the place. He wrote a remarkable letter that I invite everybody to read, because this is a testimony of how a civil servant who was dedicated to his institution had to announce what we are saying today. He is telling us in 2018, we will lose our democratic vitality that is enshrined in the independence of our institutions, including CBI, including NIA. You can think the same way about NIA. And of course, the ED that is used, interestingly, IT raids, ED raids are used the same way Indira Gandhi used them during the emergency. It's a copy and paste modus operandi. So many things, by the way, are replicated from what we saw in 75, 76.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only thing that I would add, this is my view, is that those were scrunched up within a certain time period, and whereas what we're seeing is the continuous use of these agencies against the opposition over a prolonged period of time in a sustained and planned manner. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, I do. And there are another very big difference. The emergency was improvised completely. We did a book with Pratinav Anil on the emergency in 2019. And we went very deeply into the archival sources we could find. And you realize that Mrs. Gandhi with Sanjay and a few others, SS Ray, for instance, were the back to the wall, but they had no plan for the day after. That's a completely different scenario. There is a plan. There is a majoritarian ideology that has to be unfolded, and you have an organization. Congress under Mrs. Gandhi cannot be compared to the Sangh Parivar. No comparison. So there are many differences indeed. But at the same time, you can draw some of your inspiration from what was made there and worked, because it did work the same way it's working today.
Christophe, I deliberately saved the two most pressing concerns, to my mind at least, for the last. So first of all, the judiciary. Now, you've spoken at length earlier in the episode about its performance over the past 9 years. But there's also been a tussle between the judiciary and the government over judges' appointments. What do you think about that?
Yes, certainly. I referred to that in the beginning when I said that one of the techniques for controlling the judiciary is to not appoint the judges the collegium as selected. And the list is very long. In fact, you have many lawyers who have been punished because of the way they behaved in Gujarat, in relation to the 2002 pogrom, of course, but also in relation to the fake encounters. So judges, lawyers who for one reason or the others, as amicus curiae, as advocate of one of the parties, lawyers who have been implicated in these episodes have been systematically sidelined. So you don't appoint these people. And secondly, the collegium has internalized this constraint and have resigned itself not to nominate candidates who could not join the judiciary at the Supreme Court level. But there is something else that I'd like to mention. It's not as if the Sangh Parivar had not anticipated the need to capture the Supreme Court from the inside. In fact, there is a long strategy of infiltration of the judiciary at the High Court level to begin with, because you know that a Chief Justice of a High Court will be in the Supreme Court in 10, 15, 20 years from now. And we are seeing the impact of the policy that was followed during the first Vajpayee government, the first NDA government, because you can really anticipate. And we may probably have the last Chief Justice who will not be the result of this kind of strategies.
It's a lot to think about, Christophe. But I do want to talk about the media too. A free and fair press is vital for our freedoms, of course, but there is something strange going on with it at the moment. What you're finding is that the media isn't asking questions to power. It is, in fact, making excuses for every misstep it takes. It is constantly targeting minorities and the opposition, and even asking questions to the opposition for the government's mistakes. So there is misinformation, incendiary debate, sheer lies. None of this is to suggest that there are no journalists or media houses doing their jobs, but what the mission of media in a free country should be seems to be breaking down. How do you view all this?
Yeah, of course. This is so obvious. And sometimes you can't believe your ears, really. You can't believe your eyes, because it has reached ridiculous levels sometimes. Well, the way the so-called mainstream media is controlled is again multifaceted. One, advertisements. So many newspapers depend on ads. You can monitor that easy. Two, media ownership. It's again something we saw elsewhere. Orban in Hungary is a master in this strategy of having cronies, some of the oligarchs buying TV channels, newspapers, and therefore controlling by proxy what can be said by the media. And three, you have intimidation. So many journalists are under pressure because of trolls, but also because of the owners of the newspapers themselves. And they have been eased out. Many of them have had to leave the scene because, well, the owner needs the government's protection for his other businesses. So if he wants to be in the good books of the government, if he wants to get the licenses and so on, he better behave. So there are so many ways and means that explain that gradually disinformation is prevailing over information. And last but not least, if the government doesn't want to share information, if the prime minister doesn't want to give a press conference, you miss a very important source of information. You know, in each and every democracy, in each and every liberal democracy, you have press conferences. And sometimes very routinized, very systematic. The same way you have a debate between the main contender and the man who occupies the seat of power. In the US, you have 3 debates, and you can't escape one of these debates, because that's how people can see what is the alternative. So that's another reason why disinformation can prevail, because there is no input, and you can't ask questions. And therefore, you can live in the prompter's world.
So you think there's any hope for recovering the country to bring it back to the path of the vibrant democracy it was?
Well, a point of no return has not been reached. I think there is hope indeed, but every month, every week that passes, of course, make it more difficult. And that's why the coming weeks and months will be so important. The social movement and the social movements which have taken place recently, the farmers' movements, the Bharat Jodo Yatra, have shown that there is a demand for alternation in power, for changes, but it's through elections that things will or not. There'll be very important elections in Karnataka very soon. There'll be very important elections in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh later this year. And then, of course, you'll have the 2024 Lok Sabha elections. There is a window, and Rahul's disqualification may somewhat change the equation of power. And we will see whether this is true or not in the coming elections. By the way, elections where the Election Commission will again play a big role, and we have not mentioned the Election Commission so far, but if there is one institution that had been again emulated by other countries in the world because of its huge quality, same as many others, you can't get rid of an election commissioner. Remember Mr. Seshan, you could not get rid of him. This is a time for reckoning. The Election Commission must make sure that this electoral competition is an even level playing field. The kind of money that will be spent in the coming years, month, at the time of elections, will have to be under control. Last time, if you go by the RDR's estimates, BJP spent $3.5 billion. That is as much as all the opposition parties seen together. Is it not something the Election Commission should take care of? Because if it's not a free and fair competition, then the kind of hope we are talking about will be very elusive.
I'm going to ask you to gaze into a crystal ball, Christophe. What's the next 6 months looking like?
A lot of demonstrations, I think, a lot of agitations, but in the positive sense of the word, especially in the context of the Karnataka elections, which will be so important. Karnataka is the only southern countries BJP controls. If it loses Karnataka, it can be a blow for the prospect of the country, of the party nationally. So yes, in this context, a lot of mobilization, and in the context of Raoul's disqualification, of course, I think that will make people think and rethink about the future of India's democracy.
So, Christophe, tell us about your work and any books coming up.
Yeah, one is coming out very soon in the coming 6 months on Gujarat under Modi. It's a book whose manuscript was ready in 2013, but nobody wanted to publish it. Now I found publishers, and that's the next one. And the following one is completely different. It's a history of Bombay. Well, you can say Mumbai, but with my co-author, Vanessa Caru, who is an historian, we go back to Bombay and we look at the way it became Mumbai, from Bombay to Mumbai. And there is more than a name in the change. There are many things that we are scrutinizing. And then the following project is also there on the shared secret sites, the places where people of different religions still meet. And of course, Dargahs, Ajmer Dargah Sharif, for instance, is one of the symbols of this syncretistic tradition of India. This is, for me, secularism at its best, equal recognition of different religions and different people of different religions sharing the same space in the name of spirituality. So that's another project that I am conducting with colleagues.
So, Christophe, here's a question I ask all my guests at the end of the show. Why do you do this work?
First of all, it's intellectually very stimulating. And I'm working on India since 1984. So 1984, 2023, almost 40 years. Intellectually, I'm still very stimulated. But then, of course, it becomes personal. You can't avoid the shift from intellectualism to, if you want, a more affective. I have so many friends in India. I have visited so many places which have transformed me. I've mentioned Ajmer, but I could mention so many others, including Nagpur, where Dr. Ambedkar converted to Buddhism, including, of course, Ahmedabad, Agra, Pune, Bombay for sure, Delhi. Well, that's part of my life. I've been transformed by these experiences. So and I'm not the only one to think alike. So that's why I say we are academics. We apply social sciences methods, qualitative methods, mixed methods, whatever the methods are, but we are scientific. And at the same time, there is so much of us in this that we also participate in the trajectory of a society and a culture. So that's why it's still a very large part of myself.
Christophe, it's been an absolute privilege having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashraf.
Thank you all for listening. Please visit allindiansmatter.in, that's ALLINDIANSMATTER.in for more columns and audio podcasts. You can follow me on Twitter at Ashraf Engineer, that's ASHRAFENGINER, and All Indians Count, that's ALLINDIANSCOUNT. Search for the All Indians Matter page on Facebook. On Instagram, the handle is All Indians Matter. Email me at editor@allindiansmatter.in. Catch you again soon.